Have you heard the saying, like father, like son? Well, that saying doesn't hold true for The Mask and its sequel, Son of the Mask. The original, starring Jim Carrey, released way back in 1994, and its abomination of a sequel released about a decade later are so much more different than similar. While the original turned out to be a cult comedy, the sequel was relegated to being called one of the worst sequels ever made and one of the biggest box office duds of 2005 because of all the many things they get wrong in it. In this video, we're going to dissect that very movie and tell you WTF went wrong with Son of the Mask. Now, just before we go into the video, we do have a small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. It's a small little click for you, but for us it means an awful lot. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin.
Folks, the failure of Fringe City.
The cursed conception when studio greed met creative bankruptcy. Following the success of The Mask, the film's original lead and comedic genius Jim Carrey announced that he'd be reprising the role in a sequel in a 1996 issue of Nintendo Power. The magazine even held a contest in this regard, with the winner of the contest landing a walk-on role in the sequel. However, due to his personal experience with Ace Ventura 2 When Nature Calls, Carrey decided to turn down the $10 million offer to star in The Mask sequel, which was called The Mask 2 at that time. And thus, owing to Carrey's exit, neither the movie nor the contest came to fruition. But like most other big film corporations, the movie's distributor, New Line Cinema, which seemed to have been impressed by the overwhelming success and critical reception of The Mask, decided that Jim's absence shouldn't affect its sequel, and so the concept and star cast for the sequel were completely changed. In 2001, almost 7 years after the original, New Line Cinema roped in Jamie Kennedy to take over the reins and fill in some very big shoes left by Jim the Mask Carrey. The film studio simply wanted to cash in on the popularity of the original movie, not realizing that the success of the movie depends on a lot more things than just being marketed as a sequel to something that was already popular. New Line Cinema rushed into the sequel's production with a completely new lead actor who had only one film as lead, and a completely different director, Lawrence Gutterman of Cats and Dogs fame, who would replace Chuck Russell, whose work included A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and The Scorpion King. The studio also roped in little-known Lance Kazi at the time to write the script for the sequel, but little did the studio know that their hasty corporate decision-making would jeopardize the entire movie. Owing to the studio's interference and eagerness to make some quick bucks, the story suffered. In fact, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when everybody was out of work and just at home, Jamie Kennedy released a series of in-depth videos on his YouTube channel where he talked about his experience working on the film. He said that the studio offered him the role of Son of the Mask protagonist Tim Avery after a couple of other projects he was working on with Warner Bros. Got stalled. Kennedy had initially turned down the role due to his busy schedule as he was working on the TV series The Jamie Kennedy Experiment around the same time, but the studio worked out a way and convinced him to do the role. The actor was still hesitant because Tim's character had very little screen time as the Mask. Maybe he thought he wouldn't be able to showcase his comedic talent, or so he thought. He rather wanted to play the role of Loki, which was the only versatile character in the movie, thanks to the talented Alan Cumming, who played the role rather convincingly. Kennedy said that a chance meeting with Jim Carrey convinced him to take up the role of Tim Avery, and also the director and producers pitched the film as a rom-com of a simple man going through relatable circumstances, being newly married with a struggling career and doesn't want kids because he doesn't want his kids to think of him as a failure. Kennedy also stated that he was impressed with the film's CGI and special effects and thought the film would work because of that. I wonder what made him think so. Nevertheless, the movie's biggest blooper was Kennedy himself, who just didn't make the cut as the Mask. There was something about Jim Carrey's character as Stanley Ipkiss, his timid, self-doubting nature, his escape in the form of the Mask, and his ultimate acceptance of the self that made us fall in love with the movie. Add to that Carrey's charm and his extremely flexible rubber face expressions, and you get a movie that's memorable and likeable without trying too hard. Compare that to Kennedy's puppy face expressions as the confused and struggling animator/father of a cartoonish baby with the mask's powers, almost begging us to say awe and feel pity for him, and the expressionless, not moving a facial muscle green anomaly with those brick-sized frozen teeth and the awful orange hair. And what you get is a film that reportedly grossed just $60 million worldwide against its $84 to possibly $100 million budget. From 2 hours to ADHD clusterfuck, the butchering of a film. Aside from the messy conception and the absence of Jim Carrey, another factor that supposedly contributed to the failure of The Son of the Mask is the editing, or rather, the butchering of the film. In one of those in-depth videos, Jamie Kennedy states that the filming process was a total headache due to the constant maintenance demanded by twins Liam and Ryan Falconer, who were both alternatively playing baby Alfie, aka the titular Son of the Mask, and Bear, the dog who plays Tim's pooch, Otis. Maybe that's why some people suggest you shouldn't make movies with babies or dogs in them, because not only do they steal the actor's thunder with their adorable charm, but they also steal the crew's time and energy. Jokes aside, according to Kennedy, the constant rewriting of the script to accommodate the twins and the dog's moods, combined with the tight deadline, meant that it became difficult to determine how the final cut would turn out. Which brings us to the editing. The original cut of Son of the Mask was roughly 2 hours long and had only a few changes before being screened for the studio executives. According to Kennedy, the OG cut had scope and tones and showcased much of the director's vision and attention to detail. However, the studio executives thought this cut was not funny and demanded to cut 38 minutes from the film. This editing decision, along with the aforesaid baby's mood, transformed what might have been coherent into an incoherent mess. To fill in for the not funny bits in the film, numerous VFX-based scenes focused on Alfie and Otis were added in, which resulted in what Kennedy himself described as an ADHD clusterfuck.
Long numbers arrive, I thank the Lord I'm alive. You too good to be true, I can't stop watching you.
Movie plot. And the disturbing premise no one asked for. And CGI catastrophe. Remember what made The Mask so memorable? Well, it was a simple story of a meek bank employee named Stanley Ipkiss who finds a mask and upon wearing it transforms into a supernatural, eccentric, over-the-top green playboy who exudes unmatched charm and confidence, and that lets Stanley achieve his repressed desires, only to ultimately accept who he is. Simple, relatable, humorous, feel good. However, there's a lot more going on in Son of Mask than that. It's a rollercoaster ride of incoherent narratives and characters with absolutely no relatable backstories. Let's talk about the plot. The movie begins in the Edge City Museum where we see Arthur Newman, played by Ben Stein, perhaps the only character and actor from the original in the sequel. And he's explaining Norse mythology to a group of people. He shows them a mask and says it was made by Loki, the god of mischief and the disgraced son of Odin. A man dressed in black, who happens to be Loki himself, played by Alan Cumming, becomes furious and steals the mask, only to discover that it is a fake. The real mask, which was thrown in the river by Stanley after he defeats the antagonist, makes its way downstream where Tim's dog Otis finds it, and he takes it home to our protagonist, Tim Avery, a newly married aspiring animator who despises babies for reasons that go beyond a young brat headbutting him in the groin early on in the film. Tim, who's fed up with wearing the torpedo tortoise costume at work, is invited to a Halloween party and doesn't know what to wear. His wife, Tanya, played by Traylor Howard, who seems to be having a newbie wife-baby fever, suggests he wear the old wooden mask that Otis brought home. Tim wears the mask and lights up the otherwise snooze fest of a party, dancing to a hip-hop remix of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You, and the green version of Tim becomes an instant hit with his co-workers. Returning home as the mask, Tim sleeps with and impregnates Tanya, who later tells him that she's now expecting a baby. That baby turns out to be Alfie, aka the titular Son of the Mask, a superhuman baby with the jarringly cartoonish CGI-induced superpowers of the Mask. Meanwhile, Loki, who has been haunted by his bad dad Odin, played by Bob Hoskins, and told to find the mask, learns about the baby being born with the mask's powers, and he goes searching for it, in hopes of reuniting with the mask itself, to give to his father, Odin. This sets the tone of the movie, which nobody absolutely nobody asked for. And it's pretty absurd, right? Well, wait until you see the cheap, uninspiring CGI that sticks out like a sore thumb, giving you a pain in the neck. Oh yeah, it's that bad. This very bad VFX and CGI created by Hollywood's Industrial Light and Magic and Tippett Studio come into play, especially when baby Alvy begins to act weird owing to his superpowers. The instances where Alvy's head blows up like a balloon, or when Alvy dances and hops around like Michigan J. Frog in One Froggy Evening, it's not funny at all. The bad CGI also doesn't spare Otis, who turns into this unrealistic sociopathic Looney Tunes style monster dog, which is pretty obvious because the film's CGI is based on stuff created by Chuck Jones. The film's CGI and VFX look cartoonish, rubbish, and nothing like the visually appealing effects we saw in the original 1994 film, which were inspired by the works of Tex Avery and based on the live-action animation hybrid technique used in Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Space Jam. Especially those tornado-like effects when Jim Carrey's character rotates at high speeds, transforming into the mask. So don't get me started on the giant pencil editing of CGI in the climactic Tim vs. Loki fight scene. The $84 million question: how to lose money in Hollywood. Back at the beginning of this video, I told you that Son of Mask is considered one of the biggest box office duds of all time, and I'd like to stick to that statement. Although there are other movies that have performed much worse, if you're being touted as the sequel to a movie that grossed over $350 million, there's a lot riding on you. The concept of the movie originated in 2001. However, the filming of Son of the Mask began 2 years later in August of 2003 at Fox Studios Australia in Sydney. There was a lot riding on the movie at the time because of how successful its predecessor was, so the production companies, Radar Pictures and Dark Horse Entertainment, didn't leave any stone unturned, and the movie was made on a very generous budget of around $84 million to $100 million, of which, by the way, our leading man, Jamie Kennedy, took home a handsome $2 million paycheck. New Line Cinema, who distributed the film in the US, paid $20 million for the Northern American distribution rights, thinking that the movie would perform well in its home market, while New Line Cinema's parent company, Warner Bros. Pictures, distributed the movie in Germany. The other international partners paid the rest of the bill, thinking that the film would deliver good box office returns owing to its high budget and the legacy of the original. Meanwhile, the film opened in theaters on Tuesday, February 18th, 2005 in the USA, earning $7.7 million in box office figures during its President's Day weekend. Son of the Mask trailed behind 3 other new releases: Hitch, Constantine, and Because of Winn-Dixie. In Germany, another market where the movie was expected to do well, the film was released on March 10th, 2005 and grossed just $227,000. Son of the Mask's all-time box office earnings were roughly $17 million in Northern America, $524,000 in Germany, and $42.9 million in other markets, making its all-time worldwide gross just $59.9 million against its massive $84 million budget. That means the Son of the Mask incurred a loss of around $25 million, making it a shocking financial failure and one of the decade's biggest flops. The Rotten Legacy, 6%, and the 75th worst film of the 2000s. Son of the Mask was not just a disaster at the box office, but also a critical massacre. From Roger Ebert's 1.5-star review to Rotten Tomatoes' devastating 6% rating and its place among the decade's worst films, the sequel to the critically acclaimed and well-received Mask invoked the wrath of the critics and movie lovers alike and gave them a very bad time at the theatres. Renowned film critic and film historian Roger Ebert, who was a household name in the US and a familiar face with moviegoers, gave Son of Mask an abysmal 1.5 stars. Out of 5. Ebert stated, or rather ranted in his review, and I quote, "What we basically have here is a license for filmmakers to do whatever they want with the special effects, while the plot, like Wile E. Coyote, keeps running into the wall. That pretty much sums up the entire movie. But he didn't stop at that, and he went as far as to name it the 5th worst film of 2005, and if that wasn't enough, Ebert, along with his co-host Richard Roeper, gave the film 2 thumbs down on their TV show Ebert and Roeper. Meanwhile, Roeper, in his review, stated, and I quote, "In the 5 years I've been co-hosting this show, this is the closest I've ever come to walking out halfway through the film." Another metric that highlights the gulf in class between The Mask and Son of Mask is its rating on Rotten Tomatoes, on which the film holds a terrible approval rating of 6% based on 104 reviews and a 3 out of 10 average rating. The site concludes that Son of Mask is, and I quote, "overly frantic, painfully unfunny, and sorely missing the presence of Jim Carrey." Moreover, the film ranks 75th on Rotten Tomatoes' 100 worst films reviewed in the 2000s. In response to all the bad-mouthing and poor reception, the film's leading man, Jamie Kennedy, made a documentary aptly called Heckler to shut his critics down.
Hold on. Where's everybody going?
What if Jim Carrey had done Son of the Mask? We've finally arrived at the conclusion of why Son of the Mask failed and what went wrong with it. But just to curb your wishful thinking, what if Jim Carrey did Son of the Mask? Well, even though Jamie Kennedy is widely regarded as the #1 reason for the failure of the film, there are several other factors that contributed to its dismal performances. But when Jim Carrey spoke about a sequel to The Mask back in 1996, a sort of continuation to the story where the original Mask ended, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have said yes to a story like Son of the Mask, and that seems to be the primary reason why he insisted that Jamie Kennedy do the film, despite the fact that Carrey was being offered $10 million for the role back in 1995. But having said that, if Jim Carrey did Son of the Mask, the character of Tim Avery would have been very different, more likeable, and funnier, simply because Carrey is a far better actor and he possesses a unique, unmatched comic sense that's very hard to replicate. And when Tim wears the mask would have been much more animated and expressive thanks to Carrey's hyper-realistic facial expressions. And maybe Jim Carrey's presence could have had some difference in the way the plot develops. I'm pretty sure he would have added some creative inputs of his own which could have made the movie more watchable. With that said, I wish I could see Jim Carrey reprise his role as Stanley Ipkiss and The Mask, and although there's been tons of rumours about a Mask 3 with Jim Carrey, it's not official. Until then, I'm just happy that Carrey isn't retiring anytime soon, which he said he'd be doing after 2022, and he's not completely ruling out the idea of a Mask movie, as he said in an interview that he'd be open to do it on one condition: there should be a talented filmmaker involved, someone with a vision that could get him excited enough to sign up.
When a man shows what he's really made.
Marvellous verdict. Time now for our marvellous verdict. Son of the Mask is the perfect example of a movie that failed due to a studio's greed for cashing in on its predecessor's success and its hasty corporate decision making. What are your thoughts on a studio's involvement in the creative process? Does it affect a film's story, its actors, and ultimately the box office performance? Do you know any other sequels that suffered the same fate as Son of Mask? Comment down below and let us know your thoughts. By the way, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.